At just 17 years old, Elijah Brooks shattered every preconceived notion of what strength and courage could look like. A black teenager with no legal background, Elijah walked into a courtroom dominated by seasoned professionals, lawyers in sharp suits and a judge known for his rigidity. With nothing more than a binder of notes, a too-large blazer, and an unwavering sense of justice, he stood to defend his mother from an unlawful eviction. The courtroom, at first filled with laughter and disbelief at the sight of a teenager taking on such a task, quickly grew silent as Elijah began to speak. His voice, calm but firm, carried the weight of truth. While others saw his age and background as limitations, Elijah saw them as fuel. He had watched his mother struggle for years, working tirelessly, sacrificing endlessly, only to be threatened with losing the little they had. That moment became his turning point. He didn't have a law degree, but he had something even more powerful: the will to fight. His preparation was meticulous. He combed through tenant laws, uncovered a fraudulent notary signature, and built a compelling case that couldn't be ignored. In doing so, he forced an entire courtroom, including a skeptical judge, to see past skin color, age, and income, and recognize the undeniable strength of character. Elijah's bravery sent a powerful message. Courage and intelligence are not confined to titles or privilege. They can rise from overlooked neighborhoods and underestimated voices. His act of defiance wasn't just about saving a home, it was about reclaiming dignity, demanding respect, and proving that justice doesn't belong only to the powerful. Elijah Brooks reminded everyone watching that heroism has no age, and that true strength is the audacity to stand up when no one expects you to. While the odds were overwhelmingly stacked against him, Elijah Brooks proved that determination, intellect, and a thirst for justice could cut through even the thickest walls of systemic inequality. With his mother Angela facing eviction from their modest home, the very space she had fought so hard to keep despite financial strain, Elijah refused to accept defeat. They had no money for a lawyer, no influential friends to call, and no legal expertise to lean on. But Elijah had something many overlooked: the drive to fight back. When his mother broke down in their tiny kitchen, eviction notice trembling in her hand, Elijah made a quiet but powerful decision. He would be the one to defend her. That night, while the city slept and despair threatened to overtake him, Elijah pulled his aging laptop onto the kitchen table and began his journey into the world of tenant law. The words on the screen were confusing, full of legal jargon that seemed almost intentionally complex. But Elijah didn't stop. He studied case after case, statute after statute, often reading sentences over and over until they made sense. He watched court hearings online, took notes, and cross-referenced laws with real-world examples. What started as desperation transformed into discipline. The eviction notice became his focus, the one document that threatened everything they had. At first glance, it seemed official, stamped, signed, and legally binding. But late one night, Elijah noticed something strange. The notary's signature looked unfamiliar. Curious, he investigated further and discovered that the notary listed had retired 2 years before the document was signed. A wave of realization swept over him. This wasn't just carelessness. It was fraud. That discovery was a turning point. Elijah now had proof that the eviction notice was invalid, but he knew evidence alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to present it with precision, clarity, and an understanding of the law that would stand up in court. So he dove even deeper. Borrowing books from the library, downloading legal guides, and printing tenant protection acts, Elijah built a binder filled with organized arguments, exhibits, and references. He practiced every night, speaking aloud to the empty kitchen as if a judge were sitting across from him. He taught himself courtroom procedures, legal language, and defense strategies, not because anyone told him to, but because justice demanded it. His mother watched silently, heart swelling with pride and fear. She had always taught him to speak up for what was right, but never imagined he'd need to carry such a heavy burden so soon. When the day of the hearing arrived, Elijah stepped into that courtroom, not as a boy unsure of his place, but as a young man with the quiet power of knowledge behind him. He stood tall before the judge, the same judge who had earlier mocked his presence, and presented his findings with poise. Piece by piece, he laid out the case, the retired notary, the invalid notice, the legal requirement for certified documentation, all backed by law. The courtroom, once filled with whispers and laughter, grew silent as his logic unfolded. Even the opposing attorney, a polished professional named Franklin Moore, was caught off guard, stumbling as Elijah countered each of his points with facts. Moore tried to belittle Elijah, questioning his credentials, laughing at his age. But Elijah didn't flinch. He responded with clarity, quoting legal precedents and tenant rights law with the confidence of someone who had earned his seat, not through privilege, but through pure grit. Every rebuttal, every citation came not from formal schooling, but from the long nights he spent hunched over the kitchen table, pushing past exhaustion and fear. In that courtroom, Elijah dismantled not just a fraudulent eviction, but the assumption that knowledge belongs only to the elite. He proved that access to education, especially in the digital age, is a weapon anyone can wield if they're willing to fight for it. He didn't just memorize legal terms. He understood them. He understood the system well enough to challenge it and win. His mother, sitting in the back of the courtroom with tears in her eyes, saw not just her son, but a leader emerging before her. The judge, initially skeptical, slowly began to see Elijah not as a teenager, but as an advocate. And when the gavel fell, declaring the eviction notice void and justice in favor of the Carter family, it wasn't just a legal win. It was a moral victory, a testament to the power of learning, self-discipline, and courage. Elijah's journey showed the world that knowledge is not limited to those with degrees or expensive suits. It belongs to the bold, to those who seek it, embrace it, and use it to fight for what's right. He walked into that courtroom without a law degree, but walked out with something arguably more powerful: dignity, respect, and proof that with the right information and the heart to pursue it, anyone can stand up to injustice. He became living evidence that the system, while complex and intimidating, can be challenged by someone brave enough to learn its language. In doing so, Elijah didn't just protect his home, he carved a path for others like him to follow, reminding us all that knowledge, when paired with determination, can change everything. In a courtroom where assumptions had already been made before Elijah Brooks uttered a single word, the weight of prejudice hung thick in the air. He was 17, black, dressed in an oversized blazer and sneakers, an image that, to many in that room, symbolized inexperience, unpreparedness, or even audacity. Judge Reynolds had barely looked up from his paperwork before delivering a snide remark meant to humiliate. "This isn't the gymnasium. Are you sure you're not lost on your way to basketball practice?" The courtroom chuckled, softly, but loud enough to sting. Beside the bench, the landlord's attorney, Franklin Moore, smirked with the certainty of a man who believed he'd already won. He didn't see Elijah as a threat. How could he? To him, Elijah was a child playing dress-up in a world of grown men, one who clearly didn't understand the complexity or gravity of the law. But in that moment, as laughter swirled and doubt thickened, Elijah straightened his shoulders. He met the judge's mocking gaze with calm conviction and said, "No, Your Honor, I'm here to defend my mother." That sentence cracked the courtroom's veneer. For a moment, the smirks faded. The laughter stopped. Elijah had not only claimed his space, he demanded to be seen. And from that point forward, the true trial began. Not just of legal arguments, but of battling the invisible barriers built by centuries of racial and societal bias. Judge Reynolds, known for his unyielding demeanor, leaned back in his chair, now slightly intrigued, but still skeptical. Franklin Moore, with decades of courtroom experience under his belt, didn't bother to hide his disdain. "Tell me, young man," he said smugly, "where exactly did you learn all of this? YouTube question mark? Or maybe a crash course in law from TikTok?" More laughter followed, not from cruelty alone, but from the sheer disbelief that someone like Elijah, young, black, untrained, could challenge their authority. But Elijah was unshaken. His voice, though young, held a maturity that silenced the room once more. "I studied the same laws that are supposed to protect everyone," he responded, "and if you'll allow me, I'll show how those laws apply to this case." He opened his binder with deliberate care, each page filled with evidence he had spent sleepless nights compiling: tenant law statutes, past rulings, notary requirements, and a particularly damning discovery. The notary who had allegedly signed his mother's eviction notice had retired 2 years before the document was issued. This wasn't just a clerical error, it was fraud, plain and simple. And Elijah didn't just accuse, he proved it, calmly walking the judge through every step of his reasoning, every precedent backing his claim. In doing so, Elijah forced the courtroom to confront something uncomfortable. It wasn't just about an eviction anymore. It was about how easily people judge the worth of someone based on surface impressions, skin color, age, clothes, economic background. It was about how society often assumes that authority equals correctness, that youth equals ignorance, and that blackness equals inferiority. Franklin Moore, for all his legal training, scrambled to keep up as Elijah countered his arguments point for point. Each time Moore tried to belittle him or twist the law, Elijah calmly redirected the conversation back to the facts, never once raising his voice or losing control. His poise became its own kind of power. Even Judge Reynolds, who had greeted Elijah with sarcasm, began to shift. His posture straightened, his questions grew more pointed, but not out of hostility. There was a new edge to them now, curiosity, and perhaps a hint of respect. When he asked Elijah to cite the statute that rendered the eviction notice invalid, Elijah did so without hesitation. Section 58 of the State Tenant Protection Act, reinforced by the ruling in State v. Harper, 2008. When asked to explain how procedural errors could nullify an otherwise legitimate claim, Elijah cited Franklin v. Rhodes, 2011, articulating the balance of obligation between tenant and landlord. By the time Elijah had finished, even the stern judge couldn't deny what was unfolding before him. Not a stunt, not a gimmick, but a masterclass in preparation, intellect, and quiet resistance. The gallery, once filled with smirking onlookers, was now silent. Some leaned forward, watching Elijah with new eyes. One man who had laughed earlier now whispered, "Maybe I misjudged him." An elderly woman near the back wiped tears from her eyes and said softly, "That boy has more grace than most men I've ever met." And that was the point. Elijah wasn't just fighting to save his mother's home. He was challenging a narrative. He was demanding that people see beyond his skin, his age, his background. He was proving that knowledge belongs to everyone, and that strength isn't always loud or adorned with titles. It's in showing up, prepared, when the world expects you to fail. Judge Reynolds, known for rarely offering personal comments, leaned forward and said, "You've reminded this court that justice doesn't discriminate, not by age, race, or background. It is driven by truth and courage, and you've shown both." The words hung in the air, not just as validation for Elijah, but as a quiet rebuke to the system itself, a system that nearly dismissed a legitimate fight for justice simply because of who was delivering it. In that courtroom, Elijah forced people to look inward, to question why they assumed he couldn't be smart enough, serious enough, or right enough. And perhaps more importantly, he showed others like him that standing up, even when you're underestimated, is not only possible, but powerful. By the time the gavel fell and the eviction notice was ruled invalid, the applause wasn't just for a legal victory. It was for a boy who had dared to defy the roles society tried to write for him. Elijah Brooks had not only won his mother's case, he had dismantled the idea that you need permission to pursue justice. In the face of bias, he remained steady. In the face of mockery, he remained composed. And in doing so, he taught an entire room, judge, lawyers, and onlookers alike, that truth knows no age, no title, and certainly no color. Elijah Brooks did not walk into that courtroom alone. Not really. Every step he took, every argument he delivered, every moment of courage he summoned was fueled by the unwavering love and quiet strength of his mother, Angela. She was the heart of everything. To the outside world, Angela was just another working-class black woman, a single mother who scrubbed office floors and emptied trash cans to keep food on the table. But to Elijah, she was a warrior, gentle, determined, and endlessly selfless. It was her sacrifices that carved the path he walked, her resilience that set the rhythm of his heartbeat. He had watched her come home after 12-hour shifts, her hands raw, her back aching, yet still managing to offer a warm smile and a warm meal. He had seen her stretch every dollar, hide her own pain behind encouragement, and shield him from the harsh realities of poverty for as long as she could. And it was her tears, quiet, dignified, filled with helplessness, that broke something in him the day the eviction notice arrived. Angela had always been strong, but that evening, seated at their worn kitchen table with the folded paper in her trembling hands, she looked defeated. "People like us don't win, Elijah," she had whispered. "They take everything, no matter how hard we try." Those words haunted him. They weren't just about rent or a legal battle. They were about a lifetime of systemic hardship, a lifetime of being unseen, unheard and dismissed. And Elijah, still just a teenager, felt the unbearable weight of that truth pressing down on both their shoulders. But instead of being crushed by it, he let it ignite something inside him. He could not bear to see his mother, the woman who had given him everything, lose the one thing she had fought so hard to keep, their home. That's where his courage was born. Not in pride, not in defiance, but in love. Angela's love had been his foundation his whole life, and now it was his turn to become hers. Every night he stayed up, poring over tenant laws and court procedures. It was her face that kept him going. Every legal phrase that confused him, every statute he had to reread, every case study he tried to understand. He did it all for her. He remembered how she used to sit with him while he did his homework, her tired eyes watching as she encouraged him to dream beyond their neighborhood. "Education is your freedom," she'd say, "the one thing they can't take from you." Now he was using that very tool to fight back, not just for himself, but for the woman who had never let him fall. When he told her he wanted to represent her in court, she looked at him with eyes full of both fear and faith. "You're just a boy," she had whispered. But when she saw the fire in his gaze, the conviction in his voice, she softened. "If you think you can do this," she said, "I'll stand with you." And she did. She stood with him every day, not just physically, but emotionally, leaving cups of tea by his books, gently waking him when he fell asleep at the table, and quietly watching him become something bigger than either of them had imagined. It was their bond, tested by hardship, but unbreakable, that gave Elijah his power. He didn't have a degree, a fancy suit, or a title. What he had was a mother who believed in him, who had sacrificed too much to be ignored, and that belief became his armor. Every time the judge looked at him with doubt, or the lawyer spoke to him with condescension, Elijah would remember the way Angela kissed his forehead that morning and said, "Win or lose, you've already made me proud." And somehow that gave him strength. In court, he was no longer just a teenager. He was the voice of every mother who had been silenced, every family pushed aside, every sacrifice gone unnoticed. Angela had given him a reason to fight, and in turn, he gave her a reason to hope. Their connection was not just familial, it was revolutionary, because it showed that love is not passive, love is active, powerful, and when nurtured by struggle, it can move mountains. What made their story so powerful wasn't just that a teenager stood up to the legal system. It was that he did so out of love. Elijah didn't care about proving a point. He cared about protecting the woman who had protected him his entire life. And Angela, who had spent so long carrying the world on her back, finally saw her son lifting some of that burden. Not with bitterness, but with pride. That's what made their bond so extraordinary. It wasn't just mother and son. It was two souls tethered by pain, uplifted by hope, and determined to rise together. The eviction wasn't just about losing a house. It was about losing the place where their love had grown, where late-night talks happened, where holidays were celebrated even with barely enough food, where laughter echoed through cracked walls and dreams were born under leaky roofs. Elijah wasn't just fighting for bricks and mortar. He was fighting for every memory, every sacrifice, every ounce of dignity his mother had held on to all those years. In the courtroom, when Elijah stood tall and laid out his case, He was fueled not by legal prowess, but by emotional clarity. He knew what was at stake, and when the judge finally ruled in their favor, it wasn't just a legal victory, it was an emotional triumph. Angela wept, not just from relief, but from the realization that her love had given rise to a warrior. Elijah turned to her, embracing her tightly, and said, "We did it, because they had, together. One had given life, the other had given voice, and both had reclaimed their place in a world that tried to deny them both. In the end, it was not just law that won, it was love, the kind that endures hardship, fuels resilience, and reminds the world that no matter how quiet it seems, the bond between a mother and her child is the loudest form of strength there is." By the time the courtroom grew quiet and the dust of legal tension began to settle, something extraordinary had taken root, something deeper than a legal victory, something that spoke to the power of courage, grace, and undeniable merit. Elijah Brooks, once viewed by many in that room as just a 17-year-old black teenager in an ill-fitting blazer, had shattered every assumption that tried to define or contain him. When he first walked into the courtroom, heads had turned not out of respect, but disbelief. Judge Reynolds had cracked a smug remark about gym class, while the opposing attorney, Franklin Moore, practically sneered at the thought of being challenged by a teenager with no legal background. But Elijah had not come to entertain. He had come to defend his mother, to uphold justice, and to confront an unjust system with nothing but truth, intellect, and heart. His calm presence, the quiet confidence in his voice, and the sharp clarity of his arguments dismantled every preconceived notion that authority figures in that room had built up around him. With each point Elijah delivered, with each statute he cited, and each contradiction he exposed, the courtroom was forced to reevaluate who exactly they were looking at. This was no wide-eyed youth fumbling through papers. This was a young man who had done his homework, someone who knew the law better than those who were paid to weaponize it. His composure in the face of doubt, his refusal to be rattled by Moore's dismissiveness, and his unwavering dedication to the truth were not just impressive, they were humbling. By the time Judge Reynolds called for a recess to verify Elijah's claims about the fraudulent notary signature, the room had already begun to shift. The murmurs once filled with ridicule now carried hints of awe. Even Moore, so confident in his superiority at the outset, found himself flipping through documents with visible unease, no longer certain of his footing. When court resumed and the judge re-entered with verified evidence in hand, the gravity of what Elijah had accomplished began to crystallize. His arguments weren't just valid, they were bulletproof. The forged notary signature wasn't a minor detail. It was the linchpin of the case, and Elijah had pulled it apart with surgical precision. And when Judge Reynolds finally spoke, it wasn't with sarcasm or skepticism. It was with a measured tone of respect, even humility. He questioned Elijah, probing for cracks, expecting perhaps that the young man had simply stumbled onto a lucky detail. But Elijah answered with clarity and confidence, citing case precedents, tenant protection statutes, and legal interpretations with a fluency that stunned even the most seasoned observers. The judge leaned in, his skepticism eroding with each response. And then, after a long pause, came the words that would change the air in that room forever. "Mr. Brooks, you've shown a level of preparation and understanding that rivals professionals in this courtroom." In that moment, Elijah transcended the role of a defendant's son. He became a symbol, not just of justice, but of potential, untapped, underestimated, and overlooked potential. Judge Reynolds, a man known for his strictness and pride, didn't just admit that Elijah had impressed him, he offered to mentor him. That offer, made in front of a courtroom filled with adults who had doubted Elijah, was more than an olive branch. It was an opening of a door that had long been locked for people who looked like him. It was a recognition that talent, passion, and integrity can and must be acknowledged regardless of age, status, or skin color. That moment, simple in its form, held the power to rewrite narratives, not just for Elijah, but for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong in certain rooms. Franklin Moore, once cocky and dismissive, could only sit quietly, his gaze lowered, his confidence visibly shaken. He had not just been challenged by a teenager, he had been outmatched. But even he, through gritted teeth and a clenched jaw, offered a reluctant nod when the judgment was read. The victory wasn't just in the legal decision, it was in the shift of perception, in the respect that had been forced through truth and conviction. Elijah had done something that law school doesn't teach. He had spoken truth to power and made power listen. As Elijah turned to leave the courtroom, his mother Angela clutching his hand with silent pride, there was a reverent stillness in the air. No one laughed. No one whispered in mockery. Instead, there were nods of acknowledgement, a few scattered claps, and faces that had once been cold now softened by the undeniable brilliance they had witnessed. Even the court staff, who had barely glanced at him when he entered, looked at him differently now, no longer as an anomaly, but as a young man who had earned his place. The judge's offer to mentor Elijah was more than a compliment. It was an invitation into a world that had once shut him out. It was a rare moment when the system looked back at itself and recognized it had almost missed something extraordinary. Elijah didn't have a fancy suit or a legal degree, but he had something that couldn't be taught: integrity, resilience, and purpose. And those traits, sharpened by struggle and lit by love, had forced a system built on hierarchy and pedigree to bend toward truth. Elijah's story wasn't just about winning a case. It was about rewriting expectations. He proved that justice isn't reserved for the privileged or the polished. It belongs to anyone brave enough to pursue it. His journey from an overlooked teenager to a respected legal voice was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful change comes not from those at the top, but from those who rise despite every reason not to. And as he stepped out of the courthouse, the sunlight falling warmly on his face, Elijah didn't smile in triumph. He carried himself with quiet dignity, knowing the real victory wasn't just keeping a home, it was gaining a future. He had opened a door, not just for himself, but for others who would follow. And in doing so, he reminded the world that when respect is earned through truth and courage, it has the power to transform even the most stubborn hearts and systems. Elijah Brooks' courtroom victory was far more than a legal triumph. It was a spark that ignited a vision for the future. Standing in that courtroom, once filled with doubt and quiet judgment, Elijah didn't just prove a point, he opened a path. For a 17-year-old black teenager with no formal training in law, winning a case against seasoned professionals became a powerful metaphor for what's possible when courage, intellect, and purpose align. But for Elijah, the journey didn't end with the judge's gavel or the applause of a once dismissive audience. Instead, that moment marked a beginning, a promise not only to himself, but to others who have been silenced, dismissed, or told they don't belong. Elijah didn't walk away from that courtroom thinking his job was done. He walked away with a dream: to become a lawyer, not for status or recognition, but to stand in the gap for those who can't speak for themselves. The fire that pushed him to defend his mother now burns with a deeper purpose: to use his voice for the voiceless, to challenge the systems that fail the vulnerable, and to bring justice to those ignored by it. In every step forward, Elijah carries the weight of those who have been marginalized, and the hope that their stories too can be rewritten. His story resonates far beyond his neighborhood or that courtroom. It whispers to every young person who's ever been underestimated, every child who's watched their family struggle and wondered if they could ever change things. Elijah proves that you don't need permission to make a difference, just the will to rise. And in doing so, he transforms from a teenage advocate into a symbol of hope, showing that dreams, when rooted in justice and fueled by love, can reshape the world. The story of Elijah Brooks offers a powerful and deeply resonant lesson for all of us, especially for those in their middle years, navigating the complexities of life, responsibility, and legacy. At its core, this narrative reminds us that courage is not bound by age, status, or expertise. Elijah, a 17-year-old black teenager with no legal training, defied deeply rooted societal biases and systemic injustice. Not through brute force, but through unwavering determination, love for his family, and the willingness to learn. For many adults, especially those who have faced prejudice, setbacks, or feelings of invisibility in professional or personal life, Elijah's journey is a call to remember the power of resilience and self-belief. His story also highlights the irreplaceable strength found in familial bonds. Elijah's drive stems from his mother's sacrifices, her quiet endurance, hard work, and vulnerability. As we age, we often reflect on what we pass down to our children. Values, strength, hope. Angela's unspoken teachings of love, persistence, and silent courage became the very foundation of her son's strength. This dynamic speaks directly to parents and caregivers who wonder if their efforts are seen or if their sacrifices make a difference. Elijah's story answers with a resounding yes. Moreover, this journey forces us to confront our own assumptions. From the judge to the spectators in the courtroom, many were quick to dismiss Elijah based on his appearance and youth. But through calm, evidence-based advocacy, he dismantled those prejudices and earned their respect. Not through confrontation, but through undeniable merit. In our own lives, whether in leadership, parenting, or community, we are reminded that respect earned through integrity and empathy lasts longer than any title or resume. Ultimately, Elijah's victory is not just legal, it's symbolic. It encourages us, no matter our age, to keep growing, to speak up, to believe in transformation, and to never underestimate the quiet but profound impact of doing what is right, even when the odds seem impossible. If you found Elijah's journey as powerful and inspiring as we did, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to us. It gives us the motivation to keep creating meaningful stories that shine a light on courage, justice, and hope. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with friends and family who believe in the power of truth and resilience. Together, let's build a community that uplifts unheard voices and celebrates stories that truly matter. Thank you for being part of our journey.